So if you're someone who has been watching the news lately, looking at our universities, our courts, our corporate boardrooms, and just wondering how exactly do we get here, then this deep dive is specifically for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because we are looking at the historical roadmap of our institutions today. And I know many of you listening have this really deep, intense curiosity about the history and the current state of Western civilization.
Right, you're looking for the unvarnished truth.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You want a rigorous, unfiltered analysis of what has actually happened to these foundational pillars before they were, well, as it's increasingly argued, captured by this ideological framework of feminists and Marxists.
Which is a heavy topic, but a necessary one.
It is. And if that's what you're looking for, well, you are in the exact right place. The mission of today's deep dive is to explore precisely that by reviewing a really highly provocative, newly released ebook. It's titled Reason Under Fire: How Woke Ideologies Undermine Logic and Tradition.
By Conrad Riker.
Right, published in 2025.
And, I mean, let me just say right off the bat, it is a truly massive text. We are talking about over 600 pages of really dense, heavily cited material. It covers just an enormous amount of ground.
Yeah, it's not a light beach read.
Not at all. Riker compiles this sweeping historical and cultural analysis. He goes through the subversion of the education system, the politicization of the hard sciences, the restructuring of the legal system.
The media, too.
The media, yes, and even the fundamental definitions of language and the nuclear family. The book is really designed to diagnose what the author views as the rapid and deliberate decline of Western civilization.
And before we get into the heavy lifting here, because there's obviously a lot to unpack, I need to put a couple of things on your radar real quick. First, hit the like and subscribe buttons right now.
Please do.
It really is the absolute best way to support the deep dive and ensure we can keep bringing you these intense, comprehensive breakdowns of complex material.
It helps us a ton.
Second, to fully grasp the architecture of the arguments we're about to discuss, you really need to read the source text for yourself. Seriously, go check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to grab a copy of Reason Under Fire today. Having the text in front of you will completely change how you absorb this information.
It's totally different when you can see his citations.
100%. And finally, be sure to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack for his ongoing essays and insights. Because Substack is really where this kind of unfiltered analysis is thriving right now.
It's the only place for it, really. Now, before we actually dive into the text itself, it's crucial that we set some ground rules for this discussion. We need to establish an impartiality clause, if you will.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Let's be completely transparent with you, the listener. The source material we're reviewing today contains highly politically charged content.
Very charged.
It touches on race, on gender politics culture, in ways...
Right, we are neutral.
We are not endorsing the viewpoints of the author, nor are we endorsing left-wing ideologies or right-wing ideologies.
Our role today is strictly to act as your analytical guides. We are here to impartially report on the contents of the book, to break down the specific arguments the author is making, and really just to help you understand his perspective on the history of our institutions.
We're just looking at the blueprints.
Exactly. We're going to examine the evidence he presents, the historical timelines he constructs, and explore why this specific message is resonating so strongly with his intended audience.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the preface and the introduction of the book, because the author doesn't really ease the reader into his thesis at all. He treats the opening chapters as an absolute call to arms.
Yeah, he pulls no punches.
He frames the modern cultural shifts we have seen over the last few decades, not as the inevitable march of social progress, but as a deliberate, calculated ideological war.
A war on multiple fronts.
Yes, specifically a war on men, a war on merit, on objective truth, and ultimately a war on the foundations of Western civilization. He explicitly argues that society has been hijacked by cultural Marxists, feminists, and what he broadly categorizes as the woke mob. Let's start by defining some of these terms, because he uses cultural Marxism quite a bit right out of the gate.
That is a really critical point of clarification, actually, because when the book refers to cultural Marxism, it's describing a very specific ideological shift that took place in the mid-20th century.
Right. It's not just about economics anymore.
Exactly. Traditional Marxism was primarily focused on economics, the struggle between the working class, the proletariat, and the owning class, the bourgeoisie. But the author argues that when traditional economic Marxism failed to take hold in the prosperous post-WWII West, these ideological thinkers...
Specifically the Frankfurt School, right?
Yes. Those associated with the Frankfurt School, they adapted the framework. Instead of dividing society by economic class, they began dividing society by cultural identities, so race, gender, sexual orientation.
So the oppressor versus oppressed dynamic stays the same.
The core dynamic remains exactly, but the battlefield shifted from the factory floor to the culture, the universities, and the media.
And that framework explains the psychological and emotional baseline the author establishes on page 1, because he speaks directly to men who feel a profound sense of alienation in the modern world.
He really taps into that.
He describes this pervasive atmosphere where men feel they're just constantly walking on eggshells in their own workplaces or social circles. They're afraid to speak their minds or even exist in certain spaces without being preemptively labeled as toxic or problematic.
What's fascinating here is how the text validates that specific feeling of cultural whiplash. Because the author argues that men are being explicitly told that their success is somehow unearned.
Right, that it's just a byproduct of systemic privilege.
Exactly. And meanwhile, traditional masculine traits like stoicism, competitiveness, or physical assertiveness, these are increasingly treated by modern HR departments and educational institutions as a disease that needs to be managed or cured.
Right, the book is filled with anecdotal and structural examples of this. He writes about the phenomenon of professionals losing their entire careers over a single offhand comment or a joke from a decade ago that violated these new rapidly changing social codes.
The rules keep changing.
They do. And he paints a picture of early education, where boys are essentially told to sit down and shut up. He argues that the modern classroom environment caters entirely to female learning styles and behavioral norms.
And he connects this everyday alienation to a much larger, deliberate structural shift. He asserts that this isn't just a matter of changing social etiquette or people just trying to be more polite.
It's deeper than that.
Much deeper. He argues that the foundational pillars of logic and reason, which he views as the absolute bedrock of Western civilization and the scientific method, he says they've been actively replaced by emotional appeals and identity politics.
Because it's a divide and conquer strategy.
According to the text, yes. By slicing society up into these intersectional identity groups, you create a populace that is perpetually fighting itself over perceived microaggressions.
Instead of uniting around shared national or cultural values,
Exactly.
he even points to the media landscape to back this up. He asks the reader to look at how men, particularly fathers, are portrayed in modern advertising and television.
Oh, the bumbling dad trope.
Yes, they are almost exclusively depicted in one of two ways. Either as highly dangerous, oppressive predators, or as bumbling, incompetent idiots who can't figure out how to operate a washing machine without their wife's intervention.
It's pervasive once you notice it.
Yeah, it really is. And I want you, the listener, to just pause and consider how these cultural shifts have played out in your own life. Think about your corporate diversity trainings, your university environment, or the media you consume daily. The author is essentially saying to you, you aren't crazy. The rules of the game were changed, and they were changed specifically to disadvantage you and dismantle the meritocracy.
And to understand exactly how we arrived at a place where identity politics could supersede logic and merit, the book takes us on this really deep historical dive into the subversion of education.
The first domino.
The author posits that the ideological capture of academia was the crucial first domino to fall. Because if you control the universities, you control the teachers, the lawyers, the journalists, and the future politicians.
This section of the book goes into granular detail. It details how academia transitioned from a place of objective, rigorous inquiry, where ideas were stress-tested through debate, into what he describes as a factory for ideological conformity.
Yeah, he claims we've witnessed the systematic eradication of classic literature and foundational Western philosophers.
Replaced by activist texts.
Exactly, texts that are designed not to teach students how to think, but explicitly what to think.
And the book provides really specific documented examples to illustrate this shift. One of the primary case studies he highlights is a New York school district in 2021. This district made headlines by removing Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn from their curriculum.
Which is wild.
It is because this is a foundational American novel that deals with incredibly complex themes of morality and race and the failures of antebellum society. But the district replaced it with a modern young adult novel about a teenager grappling with gender identity.
And the author uses this to illustrate how profound, challenging literature that actually requires historical context is deemed problematic.
Then it gets swapped for ideologically compliant narratives that just flatter modern sensibilities.
And it gets even more pronounced at the university level, The book cites the University of London's School of Oriental and African Studies, or SOS. In 2018, they initiated a movement to decolonize their curriculum.
And what did that mean in practice?
It meant literally removing the works of Plato and Aristotle.
Unbelievable. Why?
Because these foundational thinkers were deemed too white and too male. The author points out the sheer ideological fanaticism of this move. You are removing the very architects of Western logic ethics and the scientific method.
The philosophical tools that built the modern world.
Right, simply to appease an ideological demand for racial and gender representation.
From there, the text targets the University of California, Berkeley. The author dissects a specific course titled Decolonizing the Mind. He breaks down the syllabus, describing it as reading less like an academic exploration and more like a Marxist manifesto.
It heavily features radical writers like Frantz Fanon and bell hooks.
And the argument presented in the book is that in courses like these, students are taught to view every single human interaction, every historical event, and every social structure exclusively through the lens of oppressor versus oppressed.
There is no room for rigorous debate, nuance, or dissent in this pedagogical model. It is purely about internalizing a specific, highly political worldview.
I really want to highlight the example he gives about mathematics, because this is where the argument shifts from the humanities into areas we traditionally assume are totally immune to ideology.
The hard number.
Right. In 2021, the American Mathematical Society published a paper arguing that mathematics itself is inherently racist because it prioritizes Western ways of thinking. Math, the universal language of objective reality.
It's hard to wrap your head around.
The author argues that when you reach a point where academic institutions are claiming that the concept of an objective right or wrong answer in a math equation is a tool of colonial oppression, you've completely abandoned the concept of objective truth.
Which leads directly into a necessary exploration of postmodernism. The author identifies postmodernism as the philosophical root of this entire institutional capture.
We definitely need to define this because it's so central to his thesis.
Yeah, postmodernism is a philosophical movement that gained massive traction in the academic humanities starting in the 1960s. It was heavily driven by French thinkers like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida. In short, postmodernism is a profound skepticism toward the Enlightenment ideals of objective truth, reason, and human progress.
So instead of believing that we can use science and logic to discover objective facts about the world, postmodernists argue what exactly?
They argue that what we call truth is actually entirely subjective. It is merely a narrative constructed by whoever holds power in a society designed to maintain that power.
Okay.
Foucault, for instance, focused heavily on how language and societal institutions are used as instruments of control. Derrida focused on deconstruction, basically taking apart texts and language to show that meanings are unstable and contradictory.
So if there's no truth, it's just about power.
Exactly. The author argues that when these philosophies took over the humanities, they provided the perfect academic weapon. If there is no objective truth, then you don't need evidence to win an argument. You just need to deconstruct your opponent's language and claim their truth is oppressive.
And to prove just how intellectually bankrupt and vulnerable this postmodern academic system had become, the book brings up the legendary Sokol affair. We really need to spend some time on this because it is just a brilliant illustration of the author's point. What exactly was the Sokol affair?
It is a phenomenal piece of academic history. In 1996, a prominent physics professor at New York University named Alan Sokol became deeply concerned by the rise of postmodernism. He saw humanities professors making sweeping, nonsensical claims about physics and mathematics.
Fields they clearly didn't understand.
Right, arguing that scientific laws were just social constructs. Sokol wanted to test whether these postmodern academic journals had any actual intellectual rigor, or if they would just publish absolutely anything, no matter how absurd, as long as it sounded right, and use the correct ideological buzzwords.
So he writes a Trojan horse paper.
Exactly. He submitted a paper to a leading cultural studies journal called Social Text. The title of the paper was a masterpiece of academic jargon, transgressing the boundaries towards a transformative hermeneutics of quantum gravity.
Just reading that title gives you a headache.
And that was the point. The paper was complete intentional gibberish. Sokol strung together quotes from famous postmodern thinkers, mixed them with complex physics terminology used completely incorrectly, and essentially argued that physical reality didn't exist.
He argued that quantum gravity was merely a social construct.
Yes, a linguistic construct created by Western scientists. And the incredible part is the editors of Social Text actually published it in a special issue dedicated to the science wars.
They didn't even check the math.
They didn't understand the physics, and they didn't send it out for peer review to actual physicists. because the paper aligned perfectly with their ideological biases, because it flattered their belief that science was just an oppressive construct. They accepted it without question.
And then Sokol immediately revealed the hoax in a different magazine, Lingua Franca, exposing the editors of Social Text to international embarrassment. The author uses the Sokol affair as the ultimate historical proof that ideology had completely overridden peer review and intellectual integrity in the humanities by the late 1990s.
And he backed this up with terrifying modern statistics to show how much worse it has gotten since then. He cites a recent survey by the Heterodox Academy showing that 58% of humanities professors now identify as far left compared to only 6% who identify as conservative.
That is an extreme, impenetrable echo chamber.
Furthermore, he layers this with data from the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression FIRE, which conducts massive surveys on campus free speech. Their data found that 70% of college students today self-censor in class.
Think about the magnitude of that number. 7 out of 10 students are actively terrified to speak their minds, ask clarifying questions, or challenge the assumptions of their professors or peers.
Why? Because they fear the social ostracization, the academic penalties, and the institutional backlash of violating the prevailing ideological orthodoxy.
So let's extrapolate that out because the author asks the reader to look at the long-term consequences. If you have an entire generation of students graduating from these ideological echo chambers, moving into the corporate workforce, taking over legacy media, and staffing the government.
Students who have been trained for 4 years to prioritize emotional safety over empirical evidence.
Right. And who believe that words they disagree with are literal violence. What happens then? The book argues you inevitably get an era of fake news and alternative facts. You get a deeply fractured society that literally cannot agree on a shared basic reality.
Which brings the author's analysis to a terrifying new frontier, the hard sciences. If the humanities were the first domino to fall in the 20th century, the book argues that the hard sciences, medicine, biology, physics, are currently under active aggressive siege in the 21st century. He calls this the shift toward post-normal science.
Let's define post-normal science. How's the book using that term?
Post-normal science is a concept where the stakes are considered so high and the political urgency so great that the traditional, slow, rigorous scientific method is completely bypassed.
So the data doesn't matter as much as the cause.
Exactly. Instead of relying on objective data and open debate, a consensus is enforced by political and institutional pressure. And any dissenting voices or contrary data are aggressively silenced or smeared as dangerous misinformation. The goal is no longer the pursuit of truth, it is the protection of an ideological narrative.
To illustrate how this operates, the book details what became known as the grievance studies hoax. This was essentially a modern, massive sequel to the Sokol affair, carried out around 2018 by 3 researchers, Peter Boghossian, James Lindsay, and Helen Pluckrose. What did they do?
They wanted to see if the ideological corruption Sokol exposed in 1996 had spread into supposedly rigorous, peer-reviewed sociology and gender studies journals. So over the course of a year, they wrote 20 fake, deliberately absurd papers and submitted them to leading academic journals.
And the examples the book highlights are just wild. One of the papers claimed to analyze toxic masculinity in dog parks. It argued that dog parks were rape-condoning spaces and suggested we should train dogs out of their inherent canine biases.
Another paper was literally a chapter of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, but they simply took out the anti-Semitic language and replaced it with modern feminist buzzwords, framing it as a critique of patriarchal privilege.
And several of these papers were accepted and published by highly reputable peer-reviewed journals. The Mein Kampf rewrite was accepted by a feminist social work journal. The dog park paper was honored for its excellence.
The author of Reason Under Fire argues that this proves these disciplines are not practicing science. They are practicing activism masquerading as science. If a paper affirms the pre-existing belief that society is deeply oppressive and patriarchal, the peer reviewers will just ignore the blatantly absurd methodology and publish it.
But the book argues that the consequences go far beyond embarrassing academic journals. When this prioritization of ideology over evidence bleeds into actual medicine and psychology, it collapses public trust and destroys lives. The author highlights the profound chilling effect this has on legitimate scientific research by detailing the case of Dr. Lisa Littman in 2018.
Yes. Dr. Littman is a physician and researcher who published a groundbreaking peer-reviewed paper on a phenomenon she observed and termed rapid onset gender dysphoria, or ROGD.
We need to define ROGD because this is a highly contentious topic that the book spends a lot of time on. What exactly was Dr. Lippmann studying?
Historically, gender dysphoria was a relatively rare psychological condition that typically presented in early childhood, overwhelmingly in young boys. But around the mid 2010s, clinicians started seeing a massive, unprecedented spike in adolescent girls, teenagers with no prior history of childhood dysphoria suddenly declaring they were transgender.
Out of nowhere.
Out of nowhere. Dr. Lippmann surveyed the parents of these teenagers and noticed a distinct pattern. These declarations often happened in clusters within friend groups and almost always followed periods of heavy, prolonged immersion in social media, specifically Tumblr, Instagram, and later TikTok, where transitioning was highly glamorized.
So she posited a hypothesis. She suggested that while traditional gender dysphoria is a real and serious condition, this sudden explosive spike among teenage girls might be heavily driven by social contagion and peer influence, similar to how eating disorders like anorexia have historically spread among adolescent female peer groups.
Exactly. From a purely scientific perspective, this is a highly plausible data-driven hypothesis that urgently requires rigorous long-term testing. But the author details the absolute firestorm of backlash that Dr. Lippmann faced.
Instead of the academic and medical establishment engaging with her data, testing her hypothesis, and welcoming the debate,
Which is the fundamental core of the scientific method.
they relentlessly attacked her. Transgender activists organized massive pressure campaigns against her university, Brown University, and rather than defending academic freedom, the university caved. They removed the press release about her research from their website. She lost her consulting position, and activists tried to have her paper retracted entirely.
The book frames this not just as a mob attacking one researcher, but as a deliberate structural attack on reason itself. When scientific findings are inconvenient to the prevailing political narrative, the science is buried and the scientist is destroyed.
And the stakes of burying that science, according to the author, are catastrophic, particularly when the book examines the medical establishment's current protocols regarding puberty blockers and minors.
The author provides a deeply critical analysis of the current gender-affirming care model. He points out a critical medical fact. The drugs most commonly used to block puberty in children like Lupron were originally developed and FDA approved to treat advanced prostate cancer in men and endometriosis in women.
They have never been formally FDA approved for the treatment of gender dysphoria in children. They are being prescribed off-label.
And the book argues they are being prescribed without adequate long-term randomized controlled trials regarding their safety. The author lists the severe potential side effects that are often downplayed or ignored: irreversible impacts on bone density, severe disruption of brain development during a critical neurological window, and permanent loss of fertility.
He connects this medical recklessness directly back to the cultural capture we discussed earlier. He argues that medical professionals are terrified of being labeled bigots or losing their licenses, so they rush vulnerable children onto irreversible medical pathways based on self-diagnosis driven by social media influencers.
He points to the rising tragedy of detransitioners,
Yeah.
young people who underwent these procedures only to realize years later that their dysphoria was actually a manifestation of trauma autism or typical adolescent confusion, and they now deeply regret their medical transition.
The book highlights the highly publicized case of Kira Bell in the United Kingdom. Who is Kira Bell and why is her case so central to his argument?
Kira Bell was a young woman who, as a deeply troubled, depressed teenager, was referred to the Tavistock Clinic, which was the UK's only national gender identity clinic for children. After only a few brief appointments, she was prescribed puberty blockers, followed by cross-sex hormones, and eventually underwent a double mastectomy.
And then in her early 20s,
She realized she had made a terrible mistake. She detransitioned and subsequently sued the Tavistock Clinic, arguing that as a vulnerable minor, she could not possibly have given informed consent to experimental irreversible treatments.
her lawsuit was a massive shockwave.
It eventually led to the UK government heavily restricting puberty blockers for minors and shutting down the Tavistock Clinic entirely due to unsafe clinical practices.
Think about the magnitude of this argument. The author is asking you to imagine a world where permanent life-altering medical procedures for minors are driven not by rigorous, objective, long-term scientific study, but by social media algorithms, peer pressure, and an enforced political consensus in the medical community. The book says this isn't medicine. It's unchecked experimentation driven by ideology, and the stakes could not possibly be higher.
The text then transitions its focus. Having established the capture of education and science, the author turns his analytical lens onto the subversion of the legal system and the media.
This is huge.
He argues that these institutions have effectively abandoned the foundational principles of due process, the presumption of innocence, and balanced reporting. Instead, they increasingly operate on the mechanics of mob rule, public shaming, and advocacy journalism.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because he points to the justice system next. The examples he pulls to illustrate this shift are incredibly stark. He starts his historical timeline of this legal subversion with the 2006 Duke Lacrosse case. Let's set the scene for listeners who might not remember the details, because the book treats this as a massive turning point.
In the spring of 2006, 3 members of the Duke University men's lacrosse team were accused of a horrific crime by a woman hired to perform at a team party. Almost immediately, the national media descended on Durham, North Carolina.
But the author points out that the media did not act as objective investigators.
Right, they acted as ideological activists. They immediately framed the story entirely through the lens of intersectional power dynamics,
Yeah.
wealthy, privileged, toxic white male athletes preying on a vulnerable minority working class woman.
The narrative was set in stone before a single piece of evidence was presented in a courtroom. The university suspended the players, the coach was forced to resign, and the media published hundreds of articles crucifying these young men.
The prosecutor, Mike Nafong, aggressively pushed the case forward, clearly motivated by political ambition and the intense media pressure.
But as the actual legal process slowly played out, the entire case completely unraveled. There was no DNA evidence linking the players to the crime. The accuser's story changed constantly.
It was eventually revealed that the prosecutor had intentionally withheld exculpatory DNA evidence from the defense.
The 3 men were ultimately declared entirely innocent by the North Carolina Attorney General, and the prosecutor was disbarred and sent to jail for his misconduct.
The author uses the Duke Lacrosse case as the template. He argues this was an early glaring example of how the media and ambitious legal figures will willingly destroy the lives of innocent men if doing so serves a larger politically correct narrative about privilege and toxic masculinity.
And he connects this directly to the broader mechanics of the #MeToo movement a decade later.
The book argues that while the #MeToo movement may have started with noble intentions, exposing genuine horrific abuses of power by men like Harvey Weinstein, it rapidly morphed into a system of cultural hysteria.
A modern witch hunt.
He asserts that it became a mechanism where men could be fired publicly humiliated and have their careers permanently destroyed based entirely on unverified accusations, anonymous claims, or ambiguous encounters without any semblance of legal due process or the ability to defend themselves.
And he traces how this cultural abandonment of due process was formalized into institutional policy on college campuses through what he calls Title IX kangaroo courts. We need to clarify what Title IX is, because originally it had nothing to do with campus tribunals, right?
Correct. Title IX is a federal civil rights law passed in 1972 that simply prohibits sex-based discrimination in any school or education program receiving federal funding. Historically, it was mostly known for ensuring equal funding for women's athletics.
But the author details how, during the Obama administration, the Department of Education issued a Dear Colleague letter.
This directive aggressively expanded Title IX, requiring universities to handle allegations of sexual misconduct internally using a deeply flawed quasi-legal system.
And the book breaks down the mechanics of these campus tribunals to show how heavily the deck was stacked against the accused, who were overwhelmingly male students. The evidentiary standard was drastically lowered to a mere preponderance of the evidence.
Meaning just 51% certainty rather than beyond a reasonable doubt.
Furthermore, accused students were routinely denied the right to have legal representation present. They were denied access to the evidence against them, and crucially, they were denied the right to cross-examine their accuser.
The author argues that this is the definition of a kangaroo court. You have untrained university administrators acting as judge, jury, and executioners, stripping young men of their fundamental civil rights in the name of social justice.
The author then expands his critique of the legal system to the federal level, pointing out massive, glaring double standards in how the law is applied based entirely on the political ideology of the actors involved. He dedicates a significant portion of a chapter to comparing the state and media response to the January 6th Capitol riot with the response to the widespread 2020 Black Lives Matter riots.
Again, just to reinforce our impartiality clause, we are looking at this purely through the lens of the author's argument regarding the unequal application of the law.
Yes. How does he contrast these two events?
The author observes that the media instantly branded the January 6th riot as a coordinated insurrection and a profound threat to democracy itself. The federal government mobilized a massive dragnet utilizing aggressive pretrial detentions, solitary confinement, and seeking draconian multi-year prison sentences, even for individuals who committed nonviolent trespassing.
In stark contrast, the book points out that the 2020 riots, which lasted for months, resulted in billions of dollars in property damage, dozens of deaths, and the burning of federal courthouses and police stations were routinely described by legacy media as mostly peaceful protests.
District attorneys in major cities frequently dropped charges against rioters entirely, or politicians publicly raised bail funds for them. The author argues this demonstrates a terrifying reality. The justice system is no longer blind. It actively punishes political enemies and protects political allies.
He also looks internationally to show this is a Western-wide phenomenon. He points to the 2022 Freedom Convoy in Canada. You had thousands of peaceful working-class truckers protesting vaccine mandates in Ottawa.
The Canadian government, led by Justin Trudeau, didn't just clear the streets. They invoked emergency powers to literally freeze the personal bank accounts of the protesters and anyone who donated to them, completely bypassing the courts and due process.
The book views this as the ultimate weaponization of the financial and legal system to crush political dissent.
This systemic subversion of due process is where the author introduces his deep critique of cancel culture. He frames cancel culture not as accountability, but as the modern-day equivalent of a medieval public stoning facilitated by social media algorithms.
He highlights high-profile targets to show that no one, no matter how famous or powerful, is immune if they violate the new ideological orthodoxy. The primary example he uses is J.K. Rowling.
Here is the author of Harry Potter, one of the most beloved, successful, and philanthropic women in the world. And what was her crime?
She publicly stated in a tweet in a subsequent essay that biological sex is a material reality, and that erasing the concept of sex removes the ability of women to discuss their lived reality.
And for stating a basic biological fact that has been universally understood for all of human history, the backlash was absolute. She was immediately branded a TERF, a trans-exclusionary radical feminist. She faced death threats, her books were burned, and actors whose careers she entirely launched publicly denounced her to save their own reputations.
The author uses her case to show the sheer vitriol and religious fervor of the woke mob. If they can come for J.K. Rowling, they can come for anyone.
He also extensively details the case of James Damore, the Google engineer. This perfectly bridges the gap between cancel culture and corporate capture. What happened with Damore's memo?
In 2017, James Damore wrote an internal memo at Google responding to the company's diversity programs. In the memo, he meticulously cited established mainstream psychological and evolutionary biological research, specifically regarding the Big Five personality traits, to suggest that the gender gap in tech might not be entirely due to systemic sexism, but also due in part to average differences in population-level interest between men and women.
For example, he cited data suggesting men on average are more interested in systems and things, while women on average are more interested in people.
It was a calm, reasoned, heavily cited argument intended to improve the company's policies.
But the reaction was hysterical. The memo was leaked, the media branded it an anti-diversity screed, and Google fired Damore within days, dragging his name through the mud.
The author argues this proves that in the modern corporate environment, scientific data and reasoned argument offer zero protection if they contradict the progressive narrative of systemic oppression.
To contextualize why this legal and media landscape feels so fundamentally broken to the average citizen, the book cites the 2022 Edelman Trust Barometer. This is a highly respected, massive global survey on institutional trust. The survey revealed a staggering statistic. 59% of people now believe that journalists intentionally mislead the public.
Think about that. Nearly 60% of the population believes the press is actively, purposefully lying to them.
The author argues that when institutional trust collapses to that level, the basic social contract of a democracy fractures. He traces this back to the educational capture we discussed earlier. Law schools and journalism schools have become absolute hotbeds for critical race theory and postmodernism.
They are no longer producing objective reporters or impartial lawyers. They are producing ideological activists whose primary goal is social engineering and narrative control, not the discovery of truth.
Which brings us to the next point, because the author argues that this legal and media subversion ties directly and dangerously into the power of big tech.
Right, the digital public square.
The First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution protects your speech from government censorship. But what happens when unelected corporate monopolies in Silicon Valley become the ultimate arbiters of truth for the entire global public square?
Riker's critique of Silicon Valley in Chapter 14 is absolutely fierce. He argues that these tech giants, Google, Apple, Meta, Amazon, are utilizing their unprecedented monopolistic power to enforce ideological conformity on a scale that authoritarian governments of the past could only dream of.
They achieve this through the use of vaguely defined, constantly shifting community guidelines.
Let's talk about how these guidelines are weaponized. The book provides a massive list of examples demonstrating what he calls the digital guillotine. How do these platforms selectively enforce their rules?
The author argues the enforcement is entirely asymmetrical. They use terms like hate speech misinformation or harassment as a pretext to selectively punish conservative, libertarian, or dissenting voices while aggressively protecting and promoting progressive narratives.
He points to the banning of Alex Berenson on Twitter before Elon Musk bought the platform. Berenson was a former New York Times reporter who was permanently suspended simply for citing official government data to ask questioning skeptical questions about the efficacy of the COVID-19 mRNA vaccines regarding transmission.
The platform deemed his questions medical misinformation only for the CDC to quietly admit months later that the vaccines did not, in fact, stop transmission.
The author argues big tech acted as an enforcement arm for the state's narrative, crushing legitimate journalistic inquiry.
The book also examines the dynamics of Reddit, which brands itself as the front page of the internet. The author details how Reddit systematically purged communities that challenged progressive orthodoxy. They outright ban Unfake Donald, which was the largest community of Trump supporters on the internet, effectively silencing a massive political organizing space.
They banned Our Gender Critical, a hub for women who wanted to discuss biological reality and feminism, labeling it hate speech.
The most Orwellian example he gives is the suppression of a subreddit called r Watch Reddit Die. This was a community specifically created for the sole purpose of documenting and cataloging instances of censorship by Reddit moderators and administrators.
And Reddit actively suppressed and eventually destroyed the community that was tracking their own censorship.
He applies the same analysis to YouTube. He notes the high-profile demonetization of conservative commentator Steven Crowder. Crowder was financially crippled on the platform over crude jokes he made about a Vox journalist, Carlos Maza. YouTube claimed Crowder violated their anti-harassment policies.
However, the author points out the glaring double standard. YouTube will crush a massive conservative creator for edgy comedy while simultaneously hosting and monetizing countless channels that openly promote communism and Marxist revolution.
The book notes the historical irony here. The platform bans conservative jokes as harmful, but allows the promotion of communism, an ideology that, as the author meticulously points out, is historically responsible for the deaths of roughly 100 million people in the 20th century across the Soviet Union, Maoist China, and Cambodia.
But the terrifying and consequential example in this section of the book is the coordinated erasure of Parler in January 2021. This event is central to the author's thesis about monopoly power. What was Parler and how was it destroyed?
Parler was a rapidly rising social media platform that billed itself as a free speech alternative to Twitter. It had millions of users and was topping the App Store charts. But following the events of January 6th, big tech moved in unison.
Within a matter of 72 hours, Apple and Google removed the Parler app from their mobile app stores, cutting off access to almost all smartphones.
But the killing blow came from Amazon. Amazon Web Services, which hosted Parler's servers, suddenly terminated their contract, literally pulling the plug on the company and wiping it off the internet completely.
The tech giants justified this under the guise of combating extremism and claiming Parler lacked adequate moderation. But the author of Reason Under Fire argues this was a blatant lie. He cites data showing that significantly more planning for the January 6th riot occurred on Facebook than on Parler.
The coordinated takedown of Parler wasn't about public safety. It was a calculated monopolistic cartel move. It was designed to completely crush a rising competitor where conservative and populist dissent was allowed to flourish outside the control of the Silicon Valley consensus.
And the consequence of this monopolistic control is a massive society-wide chilling effect. Users self-censor because they know the algorithms are designed to financially, socially, and digitally ruin anyone who steps out of line. If you depend on YouTube ad revenue to feed your family, you aren't going to make a video questioning gender ideology. You comply to survive.
However, the author's not entirely pessimistic here. He points out that this extreme, heavy-handed censorship has inevitably burst massive counter-movements. The market abhors a vacuum. We are currently seeing the explosive rise of parallel digital economies and platforms.
He highlights Substack, where writers can publish directly to their audience without algorithmic interference. Rumble, an alternative video hosting platform immune to YouTube censorship. and Gab.
He also points to the massive, unprecedented popularity of independent figures like Joe Rogan, whose podcast audience dwarfs legacy media networks. These platforms and figures serve as vital sanctuaries for free expression and long-form debate outside the purview of legacy tech monopolies.
Which is exactly why we reminded you at the beginning of the show, and why we will remind you again to follow @Conrad Riker on Substack. It is one of the few places where he can publish this kind of unfiltered systemic critique without fear of being deplatformed. Now, moving into what is arguably the most culturally sensitive and deeply philosophical part of the book, the author does an extensive deep dive into the attack on traditional gender roles, the dismantling of the nuclear family, and the intentional manipulation of language itself.
This is where the author ties all the previous threads together. He argues that the exact same woke ideologies that captured the universal humanities departments, corrupted the scientific journals, and weaponized big tech have systematically targeted the most fundamental building blocks of human society, the family, and the language we use to understand reality.
Let's start with language, because the author draws heavy parallels to George Orwell's concept of newspeak in 1984. He points to extreme examples, like a primary school in the UK that made national news for literally banning teachers from using the terms boys and girls. They replaced them with gender-neutral terms in a misguided attempt to reduce gender stereotypes in young children.
The author views this not as a polite attempt at inclusivity, but as a dangerous form of linguistic anarchy. The most prominent example he dissects is the modern redefinition of the word woman. For the entirety of human history across every culture, the word woman has meant one specific objective thing, an adult human female. It is grounded in observable biological reality.
But in the span of less than a decade, institutions have attempted to redefine woman as a fluid subjective concept based entirely on internal feelings or self-identification, completely divorced from biology.
The book argues that when you subvert language to this degree, you aren't just changing definitions, you are actively eroding human logic. If a society cannot define the word women, it cannot define truth. You destroy the very tools, the very vocabulary that we require to reason, to debate, and to make sense of the physical world. It forces everyone to participate in a shared lie, which is a powerful psychological mechanism for establishing compliance.
And he seamlessly ties this linguistic manipulation directly into the physical and economic dismantling of the family unit. The author mounts a profound critique of decades of feminist theory and activism. He argues that second and third wave feminism did not just seek equal legal opportunity for women, it fundamentally sought to devalue and pathologize the traditional nuclear family.
How exactly does he claim they achieved this?
He argues that feminist campaigns systematically reframe traditional motherhood. Instead of viewing motherhood as a vital, beautiful, and socially essential role raising, the next generation of citizens' academic feminism began labeling it as the unpaid labor of the patriarchy.
The home was depicted as a prison, and the traditional husband as an oppressor. By relentlessly devaluing motherhood and promoting corporate careerism and alternative lifestyles as the only valid paths to female empowerment, the author argues society inadvertently triggered a massive demographic and social crisis.
The book pulls absolutely no punches when looking at the economic incentives that drove this crisis either. He dedicates a highly technical chapter to analyzing the impact of federal welfare policies over the last half-century. Specifically, he looks at programs like Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, or TNF, and the Earned Income Tax Credit, the EITC.
We need to break down the author's economic argument here because it is central to his thesis on the subversion of the family. How does the book claim these welfare policies penalize marriage?
The author points to a phenomenon economists call the welfare cliff, or the marriage penalty. The way these means-tested welfare programs are mathematically structured, a single mother with children receives significant financial assistance, housing vouchers, and medical care from the state. However, if she chooses to marry a working-class man who earns a modest income, their combined household income suddenly pushes them over the eligibility threshold. They lose their benefits, and their overall financial situation is actually drastically worsened by getting married.
Therefore, the author argues the state effectively stepped in and replaced the father as the primary economic provider. The government created a massive financial incentive for women to remain unmarried and have children out of wedlock, and a massive financial disincentive to form stable two-parent households. He views this not as a bug in the system, but as a feature of a bureaucratic state seeking to expand its dependency base.
And Riker highlights the devastating empirical statistical fallout of these policies over the last 50 years. The book cites harrowing data from the Department of Justice and sociological studies regarding fatherless homes, The most chilling statistic he presents is that roughly 85% of youth currently sitting in prison come from fatherless homes. 85%.
The author argues that modern feminism and state welfare policies have marginalized fathers, treating male figures in the home as entirely optional, easily replaceable by government checks, or inherently dangerous. He draws a direct, unavoidable statistical correlation between the systemic removal of fathers from the home and skyrocketing societal crises. Without the discipline, modeling, and protection of a father, we see massive spikes in youth crime, depression, high school dropout rates, and intergenerational poverty.
I want to talk directly to you, the listener, right now. Because if you have been engaged in the manosphere, or if you are simply a citizen observing the chaos around you, this is the exact historical context you have been searching for. You see the breakdown in society today. The crime, the alienation, the hostility toward men. But the author of this book is giving you the historical roadmap. He is showing you exactly how abstract academic theories in the 1960s became federal welfare policies in the 1980s and 90s. And how those welfare policies, combined with the linguistic shifts forced by modern tech platforms, systematically altered and dismantled traditional family structures over decades.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, having meticulously diagnosed this vast, interconnected, and highly intentional subversion of Western institutions, from the Ivy League to the corporate boardroom to the family dinner table, what is the author's solution? He doesn't just leave the reader with a sense of apocalyptic doom. The final section of the book, chapter 24, is entirely focused on the future of Western civilization and presents a strategic, actionable blueprint for reclaiming the West.
First and foremost, on an individual level, he demands a total, unapologetic rejection of victimhood culture. He calls on men to stop apologizing for their existence. He urges them to reject the label of toxic masculinity and instead proudly embrace the positive traditional aspects of masculinity that build civilization, physical strength, moral courage, resilience, protection of the vulnerable, and stoicism.
The author highly encourages men to form and join local in-person men's groups. He argues that men need to build physical, real-world communities to reinforce these positive traits, mentor younger men, and share knowledge completely away from the digital surveillance of big tech and the ideological gaze of progressive corporate HR departments.
On a broader structural level, the book advocates for aggressive technological and legal pushback. He urges readers to stop financially supporting corporations that despise their values. He calls for a mass exodus from captured platforms and urges the audience to support independent technology and parallel economies. As we discussed, he points to platforms like Substack as vital tools for intellectual survival.
He also gets into specific policy proposals. He suggests a modern revival of the fairness doctrine to hold legacy media monopolies accountable for their extreme bias. For those unfamiliar, the original fairness doctrine was an FCC policy implemented in 1949 that required broadcasters to present controversial issues of public importance in an honest, equitable, and balanced way. While it was repealed in 1987, the author argues a modernized version is necessary to break the ideological stranglehold of modern media conglomerates.
More importantly, he demands new ironclad legal protections against cancel culture. He argues that political affiliation and personal ideology must be established as protected classes under civil rights law. We need legislation that explicitly prevents employers from firing people or banks and payment processors from debanking people over their legal, personal, political, or religious beliefs expressed outside of the workplace. You shouldn't lose your ability to feed your family because you tweeted a biological fact on a Saturday.
His ultimate warning in the conclusion of the book is incredibly stark. The future of Western civilization depends entirely on our willingness to stand up and return to the Enlightenment principles of reason, empirical evidence, and open, fearless debate. If we lack the courage to do that, he believes the system is destined for an inevitable, catastrophic collapse.
We have just gone through an incredibly intense, deep journey analyzing Conrad Reicher's Reason Under Fire. To summarize the mission of today's deep dive, the text presents a sweeping, highly controversial, and meticulously detailed historical argument that Western institutions, from our university science departments and legal courts to our media monopolies and family structures, have been ideologically captured. The author posits that logic, merit, and tradition have been sacrificed at the altar of identity politics and woke ideology, and he is sounding the alarm for men and all citizens who value reason to stand up, build parallel structures, and reclaim their culture.
Before we sign off, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, unexamined thought inspired by the deep themes of this book. This is something we haven't explicitly covered yet in the breakdown, but it is the logical endpoint of the author's views. Imagine this scenario. If an entire generation of future leaders, engineers, and policymakers is raised in academic safe spaces where they are shielded from rigorous debate, taught that objective truths and math are just oppressive social constructs, and trained to view every minor disagreement as a traumatic microaggression, what happens to society's physical infrastructure when they are forced to confront a tangible physical global crisis?
Think about what happens during a catastrophic failure of the national power grid, or a massive global resource shortage, or a kinetic war.
Exactly. In those moments of brutal, unforgiving physical reality, you cannot simply cancel a failing nuclear reactor. You cannot trigger away a famine by calling the HR moderator. Physical reality does not care about your identity or your feelings. If our future logistical planners, doctors, and engineers lack the mental resilience, the meritocratic competence, and the objective logic required to solve hard physical problems, the collapse the author warns about may not just be a slow cultural decline, it may be literal, rapid, and physical.
That is a profoundly chilling thought to mull over. And it perfectly encapsulates why this book is causing such a massive stir and resonating with so many people. Listen, we have covered a lot of ground today, but if you want to dive into the full 600 plus pages of text, if you want to see the unfiltered arguments, the specific data points, the historical receipts, and the philosophical framework for yourself, you absolutely need to buy this book. Go to Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books right now today and purchase Reason Under Fire. Having this text in your personal library is essential for understanding this perspective.
And do not forget to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack. It is the best way to keep up with his latest essays, interact with his community discussions, and support independent, rigorous thought outside the confines of legacy media.
Finally, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the deep dive so you never miss one of our comprehensive analyses. We take the heaviest, most complex sources and break them down so you can stay informed and ahead of the curve. Thank you, yes, you the listener, for taking this intense deep dive with us today. Stay curious, stay rigorous, keep questioning the narrative, and we will see you on the next one.